Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Otto English. Now, Otto English isn't actually his real name, but we'll talk about that later. And I would say that he's probably one of the most influential voices on Twitter with his 131,000 followers now. When I originally set up the event, it was 126. But in a few weeks, you seem to have gone up another 5,000, 6,000. So, you know, obviously there are people out there who are interested in what you've got to say. Many other fans who tune into Twitter to hear you hold some, or to hear Otto hold some appalling politician to account, and usually with a fair amount of wit as well. So, I mean, I really enjoy Otto's tweets. But he does have his detractors, and Dominic Sandbrook, the writer for Unheard, called him an anti-Brexit firebrand and a woke historian. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about woke historians later. Initially, Otto wrote for television and theatre, but moved into political journalism in 2010. And you can find his articles in The Independent, New Statesman, Daily Mail, Politico, Byline Times, and other media. He's appeared on BBC News, BBC Radio, LBC, and Byline Times' TV channel. And his articles on British history and the country's obsession with class appear on the Byline's website. But we are here today to discuss his book, Fake History, 10 Great Lies That Shaped the World. And I advise you to go and get it. It's a fantastic book. I would say go to your local bookshop, but if you go to Mr. B's, you won't find any copies because I bought them all. So you might have to search a little bit wider afield. Anyway, Otto, please, may I welcome you to Bath for Europe.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, pleasure. And my very, very first question is, how and why did Otto English emerge, and what reaction have you had to the name? What's the story behind it?
Okay, so it couldn't be a better audience for this story, really. because the story goes back to, I can't even remember exactly the date now. I think it was 2013 or 14. But before that, in around 2010, just after the Conservatives came to power, I was walking through the House of Commons with my mother, who used to work in the House of Commons, sadly since died. And I walked past somebody called Jacob Rees-Mogg. And I remember, so it was 2010. I wasn't on many social media platforms. I think I was on Facebook. And I actually had met Jacob some years previously in a number of remarkable twists of fate. A friend of mine was a friend of his. And I remember walking past thinking, what on earth is he doing here? And then I realized and discovered that he had become the member of Parliament for North East
Somerset, mate.
North East Somerset, yeah, it's frozen.
Go without image.
Is it Otto who's frozen or me?
account.
It's Otto that's frozen.
Okay, you froze a bit. That's okay.
Sorry.
Yep, it's all right.
I set up a fake account in the name of Jacob Rees-Mogg. I didn't actually call him Jacob Rees-Mogg. And a bizarre thing began to happen. I ended up with thousands and thousands of Twitter followers, many journalists, politicians, Conservative Party politicians, who all thought it was genuinely him. And he got a bit cross and then was clearly told that it was flattering to have someone spoofing him. And so I was invited onto the BBC. Now, I'm afraid to say, so much has happened since. I can't actually remember when this was happening. But at the time, I was writing comedy. So it seemed sensible to me to do this, almost like a piano. You know, like if you do playing the piano, you need to do piano exercises. I thought writing a spoof kind of Private Eye-ish type character would be quite good. So I was doing that. Anyway, I was invited to the BBC to meet him. I didn't really want to go. They were very flattering and said, "Oh, you've got to come, you've got to come." And I said, "Well, no, under an assumed name." So I picked the name Otto English in order to go along. Subsequently, I thought I'll keep that name because my real name is Andrew Scott, and Andrew Scott is, of course, the sexy priest,
Yes.
and a famous television actor. And I didn't want to cramp his style, to be honest. So I thought, it's not really fair. He's doing okay, but obviously, I better pick another name. So I kept the name, and I kept it ever since. It has led to some very bizarre moments, because people are suspicious of you or whatever, and I'm very open about my real name being Andrew Scott. But Otto English is a good name. I mean, you couldn't pick a better pen name, I don't think. Because English is like Scott. Otto is a good, strong name. And so I sort of took on, I wouldn't say it was another identity. I just took on a pen name. But it's caused all sorts of excitement.
I noticed something on Twitter. Somebody was giving you a bit of a hard time about it some time ago. They were being a bit thick about it. They hadn't actually realised it was a pen name, even though
that happens quite a bit. In fact, Mike Graham of Talk TV.
Oh gosh, yes.
In a hilarious encounter, decided to go after me because I used a fake name, only for me to do a bit of fact checking, discover he uses a fake name.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
That's called Archibald. Yeah.
I love it. Anyway, this fantastic book, it covers a wide range of lies and alternative truths, from the misconception that curry comes from India to the assertion that Churchill was Britain's greatest prime minister. Now, I was reading some reviews. You've had some absolutely fantastic reviews. However, a few of the negative ones are people who are upset that you have not glorified Churchill. And somebody called you are the wokest of the woke. So why, this might be one for your next book, but why do you think people get so personally upset when heroes are challenged?
So the reason I picked Churchill, which I think is important, is because Churchill became so pivotal to Brexit and was used by both sides. He was used by our side, responsible for setting out the Council of Europe, and he was used by the other side as a sort of symbol of how Britain stood alone and took on the menace of Europe and all that kind of thing. So to me, he was the critical character in the book. But if I just did a hatchet job on Winston Churchill, that would be ahistoric, and it would not be balanced, and it would be against everything that I wanted it to be. So I tried to kind of reclaim the real Churchill, or as much as you can when you're dealing with history, from the myth. And as I say in the book, Churchill has become almost like a fictional character. But particularly as we've receded from war, he's become almost like cartoonish with his Homburg hat and his cigar and his bow tie and his speeches, to the point where criticism of him has almost, in some quarters, become tantamount to a kind of atheism. It's so the people who call me woke, that I take that as a compliment. The people who use it as an insult clearly think it's an insult, but I take that as a compliment. And as to the Churchill chapter, the single most glowing review of my book has come from the International Churchill Society, who have praised the book for, in the standout, most glowing review of all, for trying to restore some balance, because the Churchill family and the Soames family themselves are a bit embarrassed by what's happened with Churchill and how all nuance has been lost, and how any criticism of him or any attempt to establish certain truths around him, has become, as I say, almost like an insult to the nation. And the truth of Churchill is very, very interesting. And given that the man was voted Britain's number one, the country's number one Briton in that famous BBC poll in 1999, I don't know if you all remember that. But there was a poll in 1999, a very bizarre poll, which ended up with Bono in the top 20. So Bono's not even British, and this was a list of 100 greatest Britons. And I think Michael Crawford polled around 15th or 16th. And while I love Michael Crawford, I don't think in the history of this country he's possibly up there. Anyway.
No, interesting. You talk about nuance, and you do also say in your book that most people don't like things. They don't like the history complex or nuance. Do you think that had an impact with the Brexit vote?
Without a shadow of a doubt, yeah. And people say to me, what inspired the book or the stuff I wrote, and it was the complete loss of nuance, particularly around the two world wars, which bothered me and continues to bother me, although it has, the whole glorification of remembrance should be remembrance. There should be no sort of, but it turned into what people on Twitter call poppy Christmas, sort of bizarre arrangements in Sainsbury's and places like that. It's almost become like Guy Fawkes or Santa Claus. And that was very personal to me. And I think it's another reason, actually, probably why I became so cross during Brexit, and probably why my Twitter feed and writing took off, because I'm one of those people who, my father was in his mid-50s when I was born. So my father had fought in the Second World War. And my father was a Conservative councillor, actually, in Essex, and was extremely pro-European. As a child, as I walked around the streets of Harlow and Roydon delivering, I can just about remember the 1975 EEC referendum. And I remember walking around with my dad, pushing leaflets through the doors. And later on, I was actually quite Eurosceptic in my early 20s, as quite a lot of people were, around the time of Maastricht and things like that. And I remember my father was brilliant, because my father loved having balanced arguments with people over the dinner table and a glass of wine. When you could still, I don't want to be nostalgic for that, but he was very good at art. He loved a good row with me about politics. We wouldn't chat, we would just have a good old clash. And I remember him saying to me one day, he said, "You see, the thing is, darling, I don't want you to have to do what I did and what your grandfathers had to do. And that's why I support our place in the then EEC / EU. And I don't want to say it was like a moment of revelation, but we probably had that discussion several times, but I think it became a revelation. And when I saw the likes of Nigel Farage running around in 95 and 96, trying to make out that joining the EC was a betrayal of people like my father and my grandfathers. And I'm sure many of us on this Zoom have had similar stories to tell. I felt that it was an absolute insult to truth and to the sacrifice of those people and to the 50 odd years of trying to build a better country, which I believe and believed we were as a result. So, yeah, it wound me up, and I started writing articles about it. And I found when I was writing articles about it, I would get quite vitriolic reactions. So there's a story I tell in the book, actually, of being invited onto 3 Counties Radio down here in just north of London, Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire and Buckinghamshire. And the host, just before I came on, said, would you be prepared to field calls from callers? And I'd never actually been on the radio before, and so I was quite excited. I thought, oh, I'd be like James O'Brien or something. So I'm happy to field calls from callers. And the very first person to come on and ask a question was a man called Brian from High Wycombe. And Brian from High Wycombe, I'd written an article for The Independent, which is still up, which was about the overdoing of poppies and remembrance, and how it was beginning to lose its meaning, and how Farage's appropriation of it was inappropriate. And this man Brian came on, And the very first thing he said to me was, I respect what you have to say, but I think you should be shot. And I thought, right. So and so I repeated back to him what he just said. I said, you respect what I have to say, but you think I should be shot. Yeah. And he went on to explain, and I think challenged him as to whether he'd read the article, and he said he'd picked up a copy. Well, of course, the Independent has only been online for the last years, so there's no way the guy had read the article. I found that extremely shocking at the time, and but also kind of funny, but also very shocking. That reasoned debate seemed to have gone out the window.
Yeah, we definitely saw that. I'm going back to the war, though. In the prologue, you talk a little bit about your grandfather and how you had no sense of what he'd actually gone through in the war. And it's a little bit about the sense that, you know, the history that we pass on is never really the complete picture. You know, we only pass on fragments of things. You never really understand. And I also was interested in something you said further on, where you're talking about prehistoric people who found this lion. Well, there are bits of this, the lion man, this
the lion man. Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that you actually think there were people there who were creating stories. They obviously with, you know, who knows, they were thinking like us. Perhaps they were the original bullshitters. So is it actually possible ever to get any truth out of oral histories that are passed down? Do you think or do you think it doesn't matter because it's myth?
There was a really interesting exhibition in the Maritime Museum close to here a few years ago about, I can't remember which failed expedition it was, but I think it was one of the expeditions on the Northwest Passage. And there was a long section on the oral history of native people in the Arctic Circle, and how, because there was nothing else, there was no writing and there was no means of keeping record, they had developed an extraordinary system for repeating stories. And they knew it was accurate because years later, when they found diaries and reminiscences of people somewhere, that they realized that these people had got the stories accurate. So I think the notion that we pass down stories and they get exaggerated is true. I think it's certainly particularly the case in family history, which is, again, I talk about quite a lot in the book. What our grandparents did is distant from us. So in the case of my own one of my two grandfathers, the romantic story I was told about him growing up and the reality of his war, which I discovered as an adult, were two very different stories. And I understand in retrospect why my family lied about it. They didn't lie, they massaged the truth. And they massaged the truth to such an extent that it became another truth. And a truth that everybody was more comfortable with, because I think the truth of my grandfather was that he had some kind of post-traumatic stress and had a violent demeanor and an alcohol problem. So imagining that he had had this very romantic youth and done a great thing and saved the country was a very, you know, beguiling story. And I think, given so many people in our country fought in both world wars and there was so much suffering and loss, I suspect collectively the country did that to a very large extent. You know, everybody's proud. I'm proud of my father for fighting the Second World War. Everybody's proud of a relative who did something heroic. So it's not unsurprising. But we do have to try and disentangle those myths. And certainly when it's the national story, when it's things like Dunkirk or things which are foundation stories of modern Britain, it is absolutely essential that we get them right. I mean, even things like joining the EEC, we have to make sure that people understand why the UK joined the EEC. A lot of people just don't get basic things like that, partly because it's not taught in school.
But also, it's quite interesting talking about that, because actually I'm quite a bit older than you, so I actually voted in that 1975 referendum. Showing my age.
Really
But
don't
it's
look at them.
interesting. It's interesting because, you know, even the Daily Mail, you know, lots of papers that were sort of that you're now looking at, extracts from papers of the time. There was a sense that it was political as well. It wasn't just, you know, you were joining a market. There was a real sense that it was political, and that's all being swept away. So yeah, lots of
the lie that took hold was that we just joined a trading entity, you know. And you're right. Anybody who spends the trouble is, most people are extremely busy individuals. They don't have a job like mine, where I sit around researching random stuff, you know, or reading books. most people don't have time for that, and so they rely on what they're told. And in the age of multimedia and in the age of social media, we tend to rely even on the things our friends tell us on Facebook and things like that. So you get, I mean, the internet is a wonderful, wonderful thing, because the truth is in it, much more to the extent that it was when we just relied on newspapers. But at the same time, we have to make sure that the truth we're looking for, you know, is accurate, you know, well researched. Yeah.
Not the alternative truths of Trump, you know, when you have Kellyanne Conway saying, well, there are alternative truths. You talk about the research. You have a prologue, a conclusion, and each chapter in the book does actually have a lie, which around which is basically a theme for all the other stories. Were there other great lies that you could have included, but you chose not to? Was there something that perhaps ended up on the cutting room floor that you never really got around to researching because you thought, well, perhaps it won't fit here?
There was quite a few. The one that stands out for me is I wanted to write a chapter on terrorism, but I kind of got talked out of it. And the story, so it turned into another chapter on misinformation and propaganda about Napoleon. But the original version of that chapter, obviously publishers want you to have stories about people that people have heard of or have some knowledge of, because it makes it more attractive publishing proposition. That original chapter was about an incident in a place called Broken Hill in Australia in, I think off the top of my head, it was 1915, when two out-of-work ice cream men, their business had failed, attacked a picnicking train in the outback in Australia, fired shots, killed a couple of people. It was a terrorist attack. It was the first terrorist attack on Australian soil. And the reason for that was that the Turkish / Ottoman leader had declared jihad on the rest of the world. Another piece of history that everybody conveniently forgot until the term came back again. And this story was true to some extent. 2 people had been killed. It must have been a very shocking event for people in Australia who felt very remote from the violence of the outer world. But the story got exaggerated and exaggerated and exaggerated to the point where there was a belief widely held in Australia that there were roaming gangs of Turkish soldiers attacking trains. You know, everybody became paranoid. And that was partly because of a satirical article in the newspaper, and the whole thing just got out of control. And years later, people still believed it. So people were still believing this complete myth. And it fascinated me how the story continued for in some regions of Australia for decades. People, I'm sure there are still some Australians who still believe it. So that, I think, is fascinating. And we can sort of go, oh, how ridiculous that people would believe that. And then we realize that we too believe ludicrous things. And the example, again, which I put in the book, my favorite example really is the example of Dunkirk, which most people broadly misinterpret and misunderstand. I mean, most Britons, in my opinion, I can't prove it. Dominic Silver got very angry when I said most Britons. I haven't done a door-to-door survey with a little pad and paper. But I think that most people in Britain have got Dunkirk wrong, and they believe that in 1940, fishermen and local boat owners hopped in their day cruisers and their yachts and went over to the coast of France and rescued everybody. And the reason people believe that is primarily because of three films: a film called Mrs. Miniver from the middle of the Second World War, another film called Dunkirk from the 1950s, and a third film called Dunkirk, imaginatively, from 4 or 5 years ago, in which, in the last two films, that scene happens. You see these little boats and sort of yachts and paddle steamers coming over the horizon. And then there's stirring music, and it's that again is a very, very attractive story. The idea that ordinary Britons hopped in boats and went over to France and rescued people off the beach is an immensely powerful story, and that's why people like it. But it's not really true. Now, when I've gone around the country telling people that's not really true, in some of the audiences, I've heard audible gasps from the audience as people, how can that not be true? Well, what really happened was that in 1940, the British Army and our allies were trapped at Dunkirk, and ships from the UK went out and sat off the coast of France, and they needed to find a way of getting all of this mass of soldiers off the beaches and onto these big ships. So the Navy and the Merchant Navy and the Coast Guard went round the coast requisitioning any boat they could find. It wasn't ordinary people, it was sailors, merchant seamen and coast guards and some soldiers, and they took the boats over and then used them to ferry. There was one case of a man called Lightoller, Mr. Lightoller, who did genuinely go out on his own, but he too was a retired merchant seaman who had been on the Titanic. And that's the story that the most recent Dunkirk film is based on. But in the public imagination, it's sort of good old British people doing it. It's a huge myth, really. And the real story is still amazing, but it's not got that kind of soaring moment that the film has.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting for me was you said that a lot of these myths are created in our childhood through children's literature. Like one of the great books, and I'm sure I have read that, what was it called? Our Island History, Our Island Story.
Yeah.
One of those beautifully illustrated, was it Edwardian? One of those sort of Edwardian.
Yeah, so she was called H.E. Marshall, she was called.
Yeah.
And
beautiful pictures.
Gorgeous. I do.
Gorgeous.
And I'm not being funny. I'm in my top bedroom, and I do have a copy.
I was looking to see, because I'm sure I've got it with some of my old books, and then the other ones that you talk about are all, of course, the other ones we absolutely love, the Ladybird books. Oh my gosh, we have shelves of them, old King Alfred burning the cakes, and there he is burning his cakes. Could you talk a little bit about, how those influences, how that sort of all came about, and what sort of an effect you think that might have had? And also, where are we now with children's literature?
So I'm pleased to say that my 18-year-old son is studying history, and so I've had a front row seat on his curriculum, and they're doing a fantastic job. So I have no criticism of history teachers or the history curriculum, actually. And my daughter's doing a GCSE in history at the same time. They're brilliant because those lessons are teaching my children to be critical thinkers and to search out truth, all the things that a good historian or anybody really should be doing. Those books are fascinating, and like yourself, I loved them. In fact, I still love my Ladybird books, and when I was writing the book, I gathered a little sort of mini library of ladybirds that I could find and pick up in places like Greenwich Market and stuff. So I love them, and the pictures are beautiful, and a lot of those ladybird books, the non-history series in particular, are brilliant and clearly written and nicely done. The trouble is that the history books, particularly if you go back in time, they were all written by a man with a fantastic name. I think he was called Dugard Peach. And he had loads, really flamboyant name, and he had, and I remember as a child looking at all these letters after his name: M.A., Ph.D., D. Phil, something. I think he was called Lawrence Dugard Peach, and Lawrence Dugard Peach actually had started his life writing Listen with Mother in the 1940s and George Formby films. One of which, for the purposes of research, I thought, when you're researching a book, you think, I better watch a bit of that. And the George Formby film that Lawrence Dugard Peach wrote was so brilliant. I ended up wasting 2 hours watching George sing, and it was a bit like Dad's Army. Actually, it was a wartime film about the Home Guard. Anyway, the trouble was that those titles after his name were all honorary awards. He wasn't a historian. He was a guy who wrote good stories and told them well. And he sort of plagiarized a lot of his history books from H.E. Marshall. And H.E. Marshall, who wrote Our Island Story, had plagiarized her history from Shakespeare. Now, as a result, you get Falstaff popping up and people like that. Now, we all love the story of Hal and Henry IV parts 1 and 2 and Henry V, but it's not history. I mean, Agincourt did happen, and the French were defeated, but Hal didn't have some sort of crazy out there youth, and there was no Falstaff. But so the corners, the lines between truth and history get very blurred. And as I say in the book, the trouble with both those series, both the Ladybird book and the H.E. Marshall book, is that English history is told through a sort of narrative of a destiny narrative, that the idea that we are going to end up in charge, and that's the best thing for the world and everybody, and that even the bad kings and queens and even the wrong steps somehow lead to that final destiny of Britain as the top dog. And that is a really hard thing to shift. And I think a lot of the culture war stuff that's going on now, the arguments over statues, the notion that we ended slavery, therefore we're the good guys, even though we propagated the trade for hundreds of years. All of these things, the arguments over Colston, all of that culture war history, and the attempts to row back on all attempts by other much more articulate and qualified historians than myself to try and set the record straight, I think is largely a result of that, because in the popular mind, history is the history, particularly of middle-aged people like myself. History is the history of those books, and that history we were all brought up with. So I do think they had a huge impact. Yes.
I mean, I was very interested in your chapter on Genghis Khan, and also the Aztecs. That was fascinating. The fact that the Aztecs weren't necessarily completely wiped out by the conquistadores, because they were pretty bloodthirsty themselves. There was all this stuff going on, but I remember when I did A-level history, I was absolutely stunned to find out, or perhaps it was GCS, O-level it was, to find out that Richard the Lionheart wasn't such a great king, and that oh gosh, what was his name? Saladin, yes. And actually Saladin was a goodie, and he wasn't a baddie after all. All those films I'd been watching on Sunday afternoon. So you're right, but it's not just us, is it? Because I mean, you were talking about how Germany was looking towards the ideal, well, basically it was like the ideal German race was sort of established thousands of years ago. you talk about that in one of the chapters. That was part of the Lowenmensch. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so some of the Nazis, not all of them, some of the Nazi leaders believed that the Germans were descendants of the people of Atlantis. And in fact, they found the Lion Man. The Lion Man, if, for people who don't know, is the oldest physical religious object, piece of art, if you like, ever found. I think it's between 40 and 45,000 years old. And it was actually found in I mean, another weird thing about history, particularly when you're writing a book like this on such a scale, is how truly dramatic I mean, my background is in theatre and film and writing things like that. How dramatic real events can really be, just by chance. So Nazi archaeologists were digging in the back of a cave somewhere in southern Germany a week before war was declared in 1939. And this archaeologist found these fragments of mammoth tusk and put them in a cigar box and didn't think much of them and shoved them at the back of his cupboard and forgot about them. And it wasn't until he died and his collection was found that they discovered he had discovered this extraordinary object. But the reason he was there was because, just like in the Indiana Jones films, the Nazis really did send out archaeologists to try and find pieces of history that would back up these bizarre notions about racial purity, the ancient nature of the German people, all the Aryan nonsense. There's no such thing as Aryans or any of that. And it was a sort of elaborate exercise in confirmation bias. But one of the extraordinary things about it was that German archaeologists were the best funded archaeologists in the world at the time, because they were so hell-bent on proving this lunatic theory that they pumped millions of marks in, Reich marks into it in order to try and prop up the idea. And again, we can all laugh and say you wouldn't find that nowadays, but in North Korea in recent years, and indeed I believe in China as well, it's not quite as balmy as that, but in both of those countries you have had state-funded archaeologists sent out on sort of almost like medieval missions, almost like the search for the Holy Grail, in order to prove some bonkers bit of history in the country's mythology. And we have to be very on guard against that stuff, because although they're doing it physically, we sometimes find in this country that we're doing it in print.
Well, it's that sense of exceptionalism, isn't it? Yeah. Which actually has been very much the theme in all the narrative recently, historically and politically. That sense of exceptionalism, which is, where we are at the moment. When I spoke to Peter Oban a few years ago, and I asked him about the current climate of dishonesty and lying. I mean, Johnson was actually PM at the time. And I was asking him whether he thought it was as bad now as it was, or worse than it was in the 90s, when there was sort of scandal after scandal. And he said, there is no comparison with what went on before. This is absolutely, we are at, peak insanity in terms of, it's on an industrial scale. Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
I mean, what's your view of the state of where we are now?
I mean, we remember the 90s. So the 90s, again, there's always a danger that we think everything was better in the 90s, and to some extent it was, because I was younger and had more hair. But also some of the people who were sort of forced out in the 90s were forced out because of their sexuality or sex scandals or things like that. And I don't think we want to go back to an age where everybody's judging people on their private lives and sort of tabloids are exposing it and pushing people out. That does definitely seem to have changed. And I actually, personally, I think that's probably a good thing. What has changed for the worse, and what Peter Oborne was clearly hinting at, is that you can just lie now in public office and get away with it. Gone are the days when, going back to the most famous sex scandal of all, the Profumo affair in 63 or whatever it was. Gone are the days when if somebody lied in Parliament, they felt obliged to resign. And people who do resign are back 5 days later in the same job, as we've just seen.
Well, here they are.
Yeah. So the notion of truth is hammered. The notion of trust is hammered. And then you get this situation, which I meet all the time on Twitter, where people will say to me, oh, all politicians are the same, it doesn't matter, and da-da-da, and that takes root. Well, that's absolute nonsense. The idea that all politicians are the same and that they're just in it for themselves, they just want to make money and they're all liars, I think is a really dangerous notion. It's been propagated by Boris Johnson. That Boris Johnson got near the levers of power, I think should frighten us. The man should not have got anywhere near it. And a very large reason why he did was because he himself was a journalist. All of his friends were still journalists. He had newspapers like the Daily Telegraph and magazines like The Spectator and fellow travellers, Guido Fawkes and those peculiar right-wing websites, all propagating and sort of building up an energy behind him, which propelled him to the top. When I was campaigning around here for Remain in 2016, it's a story bothers me still. I was down by Brockley Station, about a mile from here, handing out leaflets, as I'm sure many people on this Zoom did. And two youngish lads got off the train and I handed them a leaflet, and they said, oh, what's this? And I started to explain. They were like 19 or 20. And one of them said, oh, F that, I'm voting for Boris. And I said, well, it's got nothing to do with Boris. Oh, no, I'm voting for Boris, he said. So Boris, even then, even back in 2016, had managed to build a sort of cult of personality, which he had been doing since he was in his 20s. And do we want to be that kind of country? Do we want to be a country where personality politics rules, and where sort of cartoonish figures can rise to the top and then prove, as Boris Johnson has proved throughout his life, that he's never up to the task. He's always after the crown. He's never actually able to deliver anything because, and I have written a lot about, in fact, I wrote his obituary right at the height of the pandemic.
Oh, did you?
In a very peculiar...
So who was that for? Who did you have to write it for?
Just between us as we're friends.
Okay.
I don't know. I wrote it for Politico. I was commissioned by they said, we think he's got 48 hours, and that's Politico in Europe. And I sat in the downstairs room here, hammering out. And the reason they asked me was, they said, we think you will attempt to be balanced, and you will not just fawn, which is what I did. But as I rewrote his story for about the 100th time, because I think if you go to the Byline website, I must have written to has paid the mortgage on this house. But I was eventually so sick of writing about Boris Johnson that I wrote an article saying I will never write about Boris Johnson again. Words to that effect.
Then you had the obituary.
But so I'd written this. I wrote this obituary, and it's amazing. Boris Johnson, brilliant at getting people to vote for him, never does anything when he's got the job. So that was the same when he was the president of the Oxford Union. That was the same when he was mayor of London. That was the same when he was the MP for, I think, Richmond or Twickenham or somewhere. When he was first an MP, he barely turned up at the House of Commons because there was no attention. He has no attention to detail. And so that's when I saw him rise through 2019 and finally head towards the door, I thought we really are in a troublesome moment here, and I don't think we're out of it, to be honest.
Oh, well, yes, no, I don't think we are. But do you actually think we have seen the back of him?
Yes. I think we've seen the back of him. I think the people in the media and his chums at the Telegraph and the Spectator and his backers like Rees-Mogg, I think they will be a menace to the likes of Sunak. And my personal theory is that the Conservative Party will end up destroying itself, much as it did in the 1990s. Only this time, the bastards will be it will still be the Eurosceptics, but like hardcore rump. Although you've still got Rishi in power, who of course was a Brexiter. So, but that's my personal theory. But maybe I'm just clinging to the wreckage of hope.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And what about, I don't know if you've got a view about the States, because obviously they've got the midterms coming. Do you think we're going to see Trump back? Or do you think he's again, flush?
Making a guess on these things is always, it's like betting on racehorses. Sometimes you get it right. You go, oh, I was right. I was right on that Zoom call to Bar.
It's all recorded.
Yeah. I've just been in the States. I was in the States over the summer on holiday with my family, but also for the purposes of research for my next book. And I did find, I'm quite a chatty person. I did find myself falling into conversation with people. And I was around, we were around Boston and New York and places like that. You try and avoid talking to politics if it's in passing, but some people did just start talking about politics to me. They were all obsessed with the price of gas, the price of petrol, which in America is ridiculously cheap. It's like $3 something a gallon. A gallon's 4.5 liters, so that's just crazy cheap. But they were all. It was a really bizarre conversation because that's the conversation everyone wanted to have. It was about filling up their tank of petrol, and some of those people were clearly Trump supporters. But my instinct is no. I don't think Trump will make a comeback because I think just as Johnson, that these people are egomaniacs first and foremost. I don't think Trump would risk another bruised ego. He's failed to come to terms with the cognitive dissonance of losing. So my instinct is he will just continue to be a sort of troublemaker in the shadows. But who knows? Those people, his supporters, the MAGA supporters, I've been researching them for my next book, and the Pizzagate people and the QAnon people are really frightening. And you see some of those views being repeated by people over here, Yeah.
Well, the whole QAnon thing that's come over here. Definitely.
Yeah. I had to keep changing hairdressers. I went to the one nearest my house. The guy said, "Have you heard these stories about a pizza?"
Gosh.
Washington. So I thought, well, I'll give it. It was during it was when we were allowed to have haircuts during the pandemic. I thought, well, I'll give him a miss for a bit. So I went to another one around the corner, and almost the opening gambit. I don't know whether Lewisham hairdressers are in a WhatsApp group sharing conspiracy theories, but yeah, it was a bit kind of scary. And in both cases, I'm afraid. Well, I'm not afraid. I did start to explain at some length that they were talking nonsense in the politest way. But then, once somebody believes in something, it is very hard to shift them of that belief. It's all there in Leon Festinger's When Prophecy Fails, which I think about. But once people are committed to an idea and a belief, it is really hard to shift them of it. There you go.
That's right. You have your expert, and they have some guy on YouTube, and it's a bit of a balance. Do you think the media, though, have not been the best in providing a good ground for us to have reasoned debates? Do you think?
So again, because I write for Byline and because I write for European Politico, I'm not in that bubble. Personally, I think that I've got the weird situation where I sort of have a chair on the sidelines. So I can see it going on. I cross paths with people, particularly when I'm doing byline TV stuff. I cross paths with people and have got quite interesting conversations with people. I hate the term the mainstream media. I loathe it with a passion. But the Westminster bubble is real, and the print media, in particular in this country, they all know each other. They're all in WhatsApp groups together, and they've all got these sort of unwritten codes of how to do things and how you behave and how you're never rude about a fellow journalist and all this kind of stuff. It's like a guild, you know. And yeah, I think that is really due an overhaul. And I also worried that in its place, you'll get not very good media outfits who try and fill the sort of vacuum that's left behind and spout out garbage and misinformation, which are a very real threat on all sides, actually, because we have to be, and I say this wherever I go, we have to be very aware that it's not just, you know, the UKIP, whatever they're calling themselves next week, tendency. Lots of an attractive lie is attractive to us all, and so I find I sometimes will spout, so accidentally, because I haven't checked it properly, I will put something out there on social media or even write it in something and it's wrong. And I think whenever any of us do that, as soon as somebody points it out to us, it's very important that we delete, apologize, and hold up our hands and go, yeah, people get it wrong sometimes. Because there's so much information, it's impossible to be right all the time.
And also, it's happening so quickly, isn't it? You know, you just don't have that chance to do the researchy thing. Coming back in about a few minutes' time, I'm handing you over to the questions to the audience, because I'm sure, well, I know that people have got things they want to ask you. But probably on a final note, we were at the protest in London, the March to Rejoin. Do you see any hope that we will at some point get our foothold back into the EU in some way or another?
Yes. I don't think it will happen soon, though.
No.
I can't say, I mean, I'm depressing. I mean, again, it's a mug's game to guess these things because you don't know. I mean, we've all been to, I mean, you know, the fact that Liz Truss was only in power for what, half of a digestive biscuit's length of time.
A lettuce.
Yeah, exactly.
Outlived by a lettuce.
But I do. I think we live in such a joined up world. And, you know, my kids' generation is so unbothered by many of the things that bothered my parents and perhaps even our generation to some extent. They live in a different, much more fluid world, and they want ease and things, you know, and I travel a lot. And it's just really difficult, much harder to travel, basic things to travel about. And also, you know, if the message gets out as it should, some of the reasons for inflation have been caused by us leaving the EU and food. When people start looking at shelves, as my wife actually and I were in Asda earlier, and she said, "Look at the price of that." It was just a random thing that I can't even remember what it was. Like a year ago, it'd been £1, and it was like nearly £2.50. Prices are going up for a number of reasons. It's partly because of the war in Ukraine, but a very large part of it has been caused by inflation because of Brexit. And I think a lot of people are like, you know, in the 80s, there was that famous election campaign slogan in America, "Where's the beef?" You know, and I think, where's the beef? Where is, you know, the big joke? Where is the Brexit benefit? There so clearly isn't one, and you do see the dial shifting in public opinion. But I think for a number of reasons, running back into the EU right now in the immediate future is probably for the birds, and I think it might even be slightly problematic because it would be like sort of getting remarried having just got divorced, you know. and I think maybe there needs, as there was from the footage, a proper debate, a grown-up debate that does not include the likes of Nigel Farage and his stupid blue passport, with adults sitting around discussing how this country moves forward. Clearly, one of the good things to do would be to get a foot back in the door. So that's what. So I think little steps would be my hope.
I think it's what's been obvious is that, you know, what we've called the Brexit omerta, there almost is a conspiracy to silence. Your politicians aren't talking about it. A lot of the mainstream media, they'll stay away from it. Yes, it's been COVID or it's been Ukraine. So I think one thing that protest did was it brought the subject of Brexit back into debate. There was a double spread. There was nothing on the BBC, of course. There never is. But there was actually a spread in the Times. So hopefully people will start talking. Anyway, thank you so much. It's been really interesting hearing you talk about your book. And now over to Emma with the questions. Thank you so much, Otto.
Thank you for having me, Jane.
Thanks, Jane. Great job with the questions. So we have a few questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to try and group them into sort of similar topics. So first one from Steve Cowie. Generally, when you're doing your research, how far back do you find that you discover that a lie or a myth suddenly sort of evaporates? How?
That's very good. I mean, so let's take Churchill as an example. All those funny stories about Churchill, you know, like the one where he bumps into Bessie Braddock, I think it is, in the House of Commons, and she says, "You're drunk," and he says, "And you're ugly, and in the morning I'll be sober," or things like that. It's remarkable how many people believe those sort of stories and jokes. It's also remarkable how easy it is to find out they're not true. I mean, you can, and the people, again, I've given them one thumbs up, I'll give them another. If you go onto the International Churchill website, the International Churchill Society website, they debunk all of those funny stories about Winston Churchill, which is a pretty solid source. You know, it's a pretty solid source. Other things are a little harder to prove. I've got a problem at the moment. I'm actually currently researching Coco Chanel, particularly during the war. There's a very limited amount of resources around Coco Chanel's wartime activities. There are stories that are kind of quite well known. There are a couple of books that have been written. There is some stuff which is in archives, which is available. And there's stuff which has been put up by the sort of Coco Chanel defenders. And I'm trying currently to work out how reliable that stuff is. But then you've got to, you know, if somebody's holding a resource, or if they're holding some information, or in the case of the Coco Chanel one, it's an interview with Malcolm Muggeridge held in 1944. If I'm suspicious about the authenticity of it, obviously it's really difficult to prove. So I dig down and down and down into that story. And sometimes as I'm coming to the conclusion now, if I'm not entirely happy with it, I will say that in the book, or I will just ignore it as a possible source. During the writing of the first one, I became there's a boat in the Imperial War Museum that was supposedly used at the evacuation of Dunkirk, and I've forgotten the name of it now. But I've been looking at that boat since childhood. My father used to take me to look at it. It's a rowing boat, a fishing boat. And as I started researching Dunkirk and the evacuation and what happened to many of the little ships after Dunkirk, an alarm bell started going off in my head as to how that boat had ended up in the Imperial War Museum. And I went down an absolute rabbit hole of Pathé News footage. That's how it had become famous. In 1965, it was 1960. They had a memorial, or maybe it was 65, they had a memorial little ships event, and lots of people on the South Coast took their boats to France for the day, anybody whose boat had been used. And as I was watching the footage, I realized this boat had become very prominent during that, but no one had really talked about it before. And I began to think, did that boat really go to Dunkirk? So I struck up this curious correspondence with the Imperial War Museum, who were very, I have to say, extremely patient with this difficult man asking questions about, they said the boat was splattered with blood from Dunkirk, but it was a boat that was used to gut fish. And so I said to him, "Are you sure that's not just the stains of 50 years of people gutting fish on it?" And we all came to the agreement that it was an important artifact, and I should shut up. but now every time I walk past it, I do say to my poor son, who I sometimes drag up there when I'm going to look at things, I go, "I'm not sure that boat really went to Dunkirk." Really not convinced. Yeah.
Well, fascinating. So a question from Ian Bartle. How widespread do you think this simplism has become? Is it more prevalent in recent decades, or is it something that people just need in general? Is it some kind of reflex? And I think I'd sort of like to add to it, because we're talking a lot about the Second World War, is I personally see a lot of nostalgia, particularly in movies and things recently. Is that something that is, again, happened in recent decades, or has nostalgia always been part of our society and our culture, basically?
So I think, with collective memory, the further we remove ourselves from things, again, the more we are susceptible to narratives, films, in the case of World War II, comic books that I read in childhood and things like that. So the simplification goes on. I mean, when the actual actors in the events die off, you are just left with fragments of memory that you have to piece together, and in our modern sense, fragments of film. I mean, Churchill is a really interesting one, because if you go on to YouTube, there's some extraordinary footage. I think he's in Walthamstow in 1945. It's during the 1945 general election. And this footage is out there. I think it's on Twitter somewhere or on YouTube. And he's booed by the crowd, many of whom are in army and naval uniforms. And they're shouting, "We want Labour, we want Labour." Well, I mean, that goes.
Funny enough, someone commented saying that their mum was at that meeting. So someone in their room, the mum was at that meeting where Churchill was booed. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, he was booed a few times. And the other remarkable thing about Churchill is he never actually won a general election. So I was brought up with a story by my mum, who was a child in the Second World War and a conservative activist and la-di-la-di-da. My mother's version of events was that Churchill, after he was booted out in 1945, the kind of public felt guilty for kicking him out and sort of collectively got together and voted him back in 1951. But in that narrative, everybody forgets that there was a 1950 general election, which Churchill lost to Attlee. And in fact, in the 1951 election, which was called in some haste, Churchill lost the popular vote and Labour won it. So more people voted for Labour in 1951 than voted for the Conservatives. Now, obviously, if you say that on Twitter or things, people go, "Oh, but that's how our system works." Well, that's great. But in what country do the people where you've got more people voting for one party, they like end up with many less seats than the other party? Yeah. So yes, I think we I think as a species, we have always been quick to forget. And I think that the people who carry the burden of, particularly horrendous events like the Holocaust, people try and keep that alive. But certainly, around World War II and around World War I think to some extent, the truth has kind of been lost. I mean, the other thing which I like to say about World War I, and I think it's a really important story that has been forgotten, is that when they brought conscription in, which I think was 1915-16, I think it was 1916, when they brought conscription in, There were mass demonstrations in Trafalgar Square against conscription. And the reason they brought conscription in was because nobody was volunteering anymore. And the reason nobody was volunteering anymore was because either people were being killed or they were coming back horrifically injured. So the idea that the whole country came together 1914, 1918 and took on the Imperial German army and their allies, and that everybody was up for it, isn't true either. But over time, that kind of got sidelined and forgotten.
Ian has a follow-up question. So where is the line with artistic license? So obviously we talked a lot about Second World War. There are plenty of movies about the Second World War, but there's a current debate also about things like The Crown, which this time they've actually put a disclaimer. I think on the new series there'll be a disclaimer saying that not all the content is true. So where's the line between sort of artistic license and sort of simplism?
Yes. Well, I can play my trump card here, because not only did I write Boris Johnson's obituary, but I also wrote the Queen's. I wrote the Queen's for Politico as well, and Prince Philip's, actually. And it was quite interesting writing Prince Philip's obituary, because when people read it, people said to me, "Oh, I saw some of that in The Crown."
Yeah.
That it became a sort of point of reference for people, and some people, the people who read my obituary of Elizabeth II, also said that they'd seen bits from The Crown. The reason I bring that up is not to sort of say, "Oh, I wrote obituaries of the Queen," but to say how difficult it was, because I wanted to write an obituary of the Queen which was about the human being, the actual woman, not the legend, not the crown, not the lady who opened Parliament. I wanted to find out who Elizabeth Windsor was. And you have no idea how difficult that is. I've never found anything I was commissioned to write as difficult as that. I think you could find out more about Genghis Khan or Henry V than you could about the Queen, because they had an ironclad fence around the private person, which I kind of understand. It's not a criticism of the Queen at all, but if you're trying to write an obituary of the person, and there's literally, and almost all the biographies are fawning. You see, they're fawning pro-royal biographies. It was incredibly difficult. So I have a lot of admiration for the makers of The Crown, because they have tried, I think, as much as possible to tell the story roughly as it was. I suspect they've got a lot of things wrong. I notice that people get particularly angry when they skirt around things which people consider to be off limits. But you know, I'm afraid I'm not. I'm in a weird position. I don't dislike the royal family, but I'm not a monarchist either. I think we need a bit more openness and truth around that whole institution. So until that time comes, I think you will have TV series like The Crown guessing kind of to some extent what happened. I heard Kate Moss, not the model, but the author, discussing that very topic far more articulately than I have just done a few weeks ago at a tortoise event. And she was very good on it. She said that quite often historians, like, you know, the man tells of this world, they get the authors get things kind of right, which historians miss out, because humans at the end of the day are human beings, you know, with human emotions, human betrayals. So just as history repeats itself, so patterns of human behavior repeat themselves to some extent. I suspect that's what they did in The Crown.
Yeah. So from Peter Martin, to what extent do you think that some of those people telling political lies, actually believe them? That is to say, are they more delusions than lies?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you start telling the lie and keep repeating the lie, I mean, people love to trot that out. That's also a bit of fake history. That was actually the Germans talking about the British. that line, the more often you repeat a lie, the more likely people are to believe it, was actually, I think it was Goebbels describing the British government. But please look that up and don't take me at my word, but I'm pretty sure that's what happened. But everyone's going, oh, it's Himmler said. Yeah, I think if people keep, I mean, again, returning to the family history thing, if you keep telling, all of us sort of, I mean, you know, I'm a storyteller as well. If you're telling a story about yourself, you do find that you might elaborate a bit just to make it a slightly better story. And I'm sure that a lot of those politicians, like Mark Francois and people, I think they're just a bit stupid.
There is an element, like you say, if you've got a story that you've told for the last 10, 15, 20 years, you have probably added some details, and in your mind it then becomes the truth.
Yes.
So there's a
John Redwood. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, there's a difference between you sort of telling a good story down the pub and then actually lying to the nation in order to sort of swing a vote one way or the other. But it's human memory in particular is very deceptive.
It
and is not none of us are reliable narrators in our own lives, really.
And again, that's why the Google search engine is everybody's friend. You know, I was there's this thing called the Mandela effect. I don't know if you know what that is. The Mandela effect was actually coined by, I think she was a psychic or something, but it has kind of gained currency on the internet. It goes back to the death of Nelson Mandela, which was 7 years ago, 2019. Anyway, when Mandela died, and this did happen because I spent a merry few hours going back as far as I could on Twitter to 2016, whenever he died. Check it. A lot of people I thought Mandela was already dead, but like a lot of people, and a lot of people seem to believe he died in the 70s or 80s, which is weird. I mean, because if you're following politics, how you could think that Mandela had died in the 70s or 80s seems ridiculous. What people had done was they had confused the Richard Attenborough film Cry Freedom about Steve Biko,
Right.
with the death with Nelson Mandela. They confused Biko with Mandela. And this is called the Mandela effect, is when people are absolutely certain that something had happened in the past that didn't happen in the past. And we all kind of suffer degrees of Mandela effect. I remember as a child watching the siege of the Iranian embassy very much against my will because there was a John Wayne film on the other channel. I think they suspended the John Wayne film to put on the siege of the Iranian embassy. And in my head, I was a huge John Wayne fan as a child. And in my head, I was convinced it was Rio Bravo or something like that. But I did actually recently look it up and I was completely wrong. I'd totally misremembered what had happened and what channel I was watching.
I just looked it up. He died in 2013. From Anna Berrier, do you think there's any merit in pushing for a general election now?
I mean, Labour will keep calling for a general election. I think it's a tricky one with Rishi Sunak because we don't.
Oh, I've lost the sound. Hang on. Can everyone else hear Otto?
No.
No. Sorry, Otto, we've lost the sound.
I think you muted yourself.
Oh, did I?
Did I? Right.
My instinct, having looked at his cabinet and having read secondhand what he said in Question Time today, but Prime Minister's questions, my instinct is that this is all going to kind of crumble by itself, but he probably needs to be given time to fail. And maybe Labour will slip a little bit in the polls and then bounce back up again. I think the Conservative Party are in such a horrendous mess. I really can't see themselves rising phoenix-like from it. I really truly believe they're going to destroy themselves. So maybe now is not really the time for a general election, as people say, because Rishi needs to establish himself as the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, and Starmer needs to be getting back on that. I don't think it's the time, no.
Okay. So I'm just going to wrap up with one last question, but I just wanted to acknowledge there are a few people in the chat that have been discussing, several of them have lived in Germany during either while it was East Germany or sort of slightly after. So there's some quite interesting sort of inputs into that, particularly Andrea Johnson, who lived in East Germany, and she would watch the news from both sides. So you could really see the difference in reporting of the same events, but in quite a strong way. So that clearly taught her a lot about misinformation at an early age, I imagine. But yes, if you want to read through the chat, some really interesting sort of inputs and things like that. But the final question that I think would tie it up quite nicely, can you give us any insights into what is in your next book?
Yes. Please order it immediately. Go from this place. No. So my next book is sort of continuation on the theme. It's going to be called Fake Heroes. So it's not the world's most imaginative title. However, it's about individuals. So it's about it's really the idea of the great men of history myth turned on its head. So I will be examining the lives of, it's more than 10 actually, people, a lot of them from the 20th century and recent times, some of them stretching back into the 15th and 16th century. I'm right in the middle of it now, and I'm a middle-aged man who's finally been given the chance to write books, and I wake up in the morning thinking how incredibly lucky I am. That's my parting message, how incredibly lucky I am that A, people like your good selves are willing to come out and listen to me blather on and give my family a break, and B, that a publisher puts its faith in me and gets me to write books about things which I love doing. You know, it's literally a fantasy job for me. So I'm very grateful. I hope people enjoy reading it as much as I've enjoyed writing it, because I genuinely love writing these books and getting lost in these events. And I'm looking forward to sending the first copy to a man called Dominic Sambrook.
I'm sure he'll enjoy it.
I hope so. Yeah, I'm going to send him a signed copy this time. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's always wonderful to meet people who genuinely love what they do and clearly sort of very enthusiastic about the topic. So I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to your new book as well. Obviously, Otto's current book is still for sale. Obviously, go and find it in your local bookshop or other sort of larger retailers and have it available. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Jane to do the final sort of wrap up, if that's all right. But a big thank you from me and from everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Well, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone, and obviously especially to Otto. When I read your tweets now, I can visit you, and I will read them with even more interest than ever. Thank you so much for coming. We don't have any events planned at the moment, but please check on our website, check on our Twitter feed, and we'll keep you all posted. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. And as I said, just let's, keep the conversation going about Brexit, and who knows when we'll have the next bus up to London. So thank you, Otto, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.